Welcome back, church family, to our daily devotional series, Worship Over Worry. We hope that this is an encouragement to you. Enjoy.
Good morning, church. Welcome back to our daily devotional where we're in this series. We're actually wrapping it up. Worship Over Worry, where we've been studying through the Psalms. Different staff members have walked you through some of the Psalms and just really looking at the hope and the comfort and the peace that we find in the Psalms that God's given to us. And we started yesterday looking at Psalm 23, and we looked at verses 1 through 3, where we said, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters." And verse 3 says, "He restores my soul, and he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake." Well, today we're going to look at just verse 4. Probably the verse that is most quoted out of Psalm 23, probably the verse that's most talked about or used within devotions or teachings. And verse 4 says this: "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff comfort me." And we're going to look at this verse. We're going to talk about this verse. I mean, this might be the verse that connects the most to our lives, and not just in the situation and what we're experiencing and facing now, but throughout our lives. It's this verse that we probably run back to or read out loud or even preach to ourselves over and over. When we have to love this verse too, right? Because the Bible doesn't lie to us about reality. You notice it says even though. It doesn't say if, it says even though. It's reminding us that there's going to be valleys. And you notice that when David writes this, he changes from he to you. In verses 1 through 3, he talked about he leads me, he guides me, to verse 4, he goes to you. So in the midst of the valleys we walk, there's an intimacy with God that deepens, right? Our intimacy with God would deepen in that moment. So we're going to go from sharing about God to crying out to God in this Psalm 23. So he leads us in those places in verses 1 through 3, and even into the valleys in verse 4. And we are reminded, even as we go into the valleys, of what we're taught in verse 1, which: "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," meaning I lack nothing. Even in the valleys, I lack nothing. So even though I walk, again, we know it will happen. We know it is to be true. Many of us have faced those valleys in our life. We face those, whether it's the valley of death or it's the dark night of the soul type of moment, those despair moments, those hopeless moments. We know it's true. I may not be ready, but I'm aware that this is going to be something that happens in life, and maybe in the in light of what's going on, that for some maybe you're defining or describing or characterizing this moment as kind of that valley, and sometimes we don't just like fall into the valley. It's a slow process, kind of sliding into it, and through all that we are reminded that we are to be trusting the shepherd, and we're confident in his presence. We're walking with the good shepherd. That's how David started this psalm. We're being led by the good shepherd. We're continuing to know his desire to care for us and to keep us and to love us. And we remember that the shepherd would never lead us through a place he hasn't been already. Remember, we said yesterday in our last devotion that Jesus is connected into this psalm because in John 10, Jesus calls himself the Good Shepherd. And so when we think about this, he as he leads us through, he doesn't leave us there. And this isn't a place that he hasn't already been. Can we just sit in that for a moment, that Jesus knows what the valleys are of life as he lived on earth and experienced those, and maybe be reminded again that there's still victory found in him. And so David talks about walking through the valley of the shadow of death, and valleys are just that, right? They're not dead ends. They're not cul-de-sacs. Like once you get into the valley, it's just not, that's the end point, or they're not these cul-de-sacs where you just keep going, in this circle, but they're simply valleys. There's an in and there's an out. And And when you think about, shepherds and in the flock of the sheep, sometimes going from pasture to pasture, it wasn't separated by fences, it was separated by valleys. And so you think about, we go into the valley and sometimes we don't know the why, sometimes we do. But while we're there, we know that there's something on the other side that is to be greater. God's not about our mediocrity, so he's going to lead us in and through because he wants the best for us. And he has the best for us. And so these valleys of life, when we go through life, and as we're talking about worship over worry, worship over anxiety, worshiping the God that in the midst of what we might say is a valley of our life right now, we're reminded that he's led us and he's there with us. We're not just speaking about the deepest valley, the valley of death, but we're thinking about the valleys that we're facing throughout our life. And again, it could be what's happening now, but it might be for times to come. And so there's some comfort here and some words here, that David's trying to speak to us, that we're not to be discouraged through all of those life valleys that we experience or that we face. Let me say it like this. The valleys are not destinations. These aren't destinations for us to end in. And God will never leave us there by ourselves as he leads us through it. Jesus being the good shepherd, he's there with us and he never leaves us. Some of us today, we have this choice. We can try to lead ourselves through the valley, or we could trust the good shepherd while we're in the valley to lead us through. And so David, again, he's writing to us. He says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. When you think about that shadow of death, death is real. Death is real. We'll all be caught by it. And probably as the numbers are reported of those who lost their life to this virus, it seems even more real because it's more upfront. It's kind of more in our face through this. And maybe at times we kind of go through life and we don't think, or we don't spend a lot of time thinking about that. But again, the Bible is real with us. You got to love this about the Bible, that it doesn't lie to us about reality. So the shadow of death, death is real, and unless Jesus comes back, we'll all be caught by that. But to the believer, death is just this mere shadow to walk through into the bright, glorious light of our good shepherd in King Jesus. Even Jesus was caught by this, right? But for a far greater purpose, to conquer it for us. Octavius Winslow, I love his writing, pastor, theologian. He writes this, and I want you to be encouraged about what it's kind of long, but I want to read it to you because I think there's some encouragement here. He says, we must keep in view the essential distinction of Christ's death and ours. He says, Christ suffered death as a substitutionary offering of his church. Consequently, death was to him not what it is to us. He says a covenant blessing, but an unrepealed, unmitigated curse. He met not the shadow, but the substance of death. Not the phantom, but the reality. Suffering countless millions of deaths in one. He says, if it is an appalling event for the one individual to die, what must have been the bitterness of death to Christ, dying the death, the sting of each buried in his heart of every individual sheep of his flock. He says, oh, had he not been God as he was man, and had not his love been equal to his deity, infinite, boundless, fathomless, how could he have drank and exhausted that tremendous cup of death's unmingled bitterness? He says, consider its ingredients, all the sins of his church, the curse entailed by those sins, the condemnation involved in the curse, yet all of this he endured in the sacrificial, sin-atoning sufferings and death through which he passed. And in that moment, it changed everything. It changed everything for those who would call Jesus Lord and Savior. It's our great hope. And that hope produces peace, a peace that surpasses all things. That valley of the shadow of death, the death has now no sting. How comforting it is for this truth. I mean, Revelation 1:18 says, I died, as Jesus is speaking to John. He says, I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. I will fear no evil, for you are with me, is what David says as he continues in verse 4. It's a strong confidence. It's a boldness that David's declaring, almost like he knew about this because he was a shepherd, meaning you'll give your everything to protect your flock. That was David's life, and he knew that about his good shepherd, the shepherd. There was a story about the lights going off during a church service one time. And the preacher who was up there was standing there in the dark trying to figure out. And a deacon, an elderly deacon in the back, he yelled out and he said, "Preach on, preacher. We can still see Jesus in the dark." I love that, because sometimes that's the only place we can see Jesus is in the dark. And even when you can't see him, be assured of the good news that he sees you. He's looking at you. I mean, death cannot sting me, Christ has died. The grave cannot hold me, Christ is risen. Sin cannot condemn me, Christ has atoned. Satan cannot touch me, for Christ has conquered. And our promise is, for you are with me. You notice that's the last part of that. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. That's the promise. The great shepherd, the Lord, the Savior, the deliverer, the protector is with us. He's together with us. He's united with us. He's leading us. He's carrying us at times. And then he says this at the end. He says, your rod and your staff comfort me. I mean, even in the valley, David talks about being comforted, that Jesus comforts us, right? The rod was used to count the number of sheep as they would enter into the pen for the night, and they would pass under the rod. The rod was also used to protect. It was this long knotted stick that they would use to protect the sheep from predators. And he's talking about how it comforts him. He's talking about the staff. The staff is that what you've seen probably a lot in movies and in shows, the long staff that has the little crook at the top, and that staff was used to comfort, and it was a representation of compassion as the shepherd would use it to bring the sheep away from maybe the rocky cliff and the ones that had strayed away from the safety of the flock and the shepherd, and he would use it to bring him back. And so we remember as we walk through this valley that God is with us, and in the valley he comforts us. He uses, the tools given here, as David talks about, to comfort us. So remember today, church, that he is with us. He's with us every day, that we don't walk out on our own, but he leads us through. We have a living God that's with us. God never wastes a tear. He